To explore group policy, on my domain controller, I'm going to go to Tools, and in Tools, I will select Group Policy Management. So that pulls up my Group Policy Management. Now, what I can see in this console, my Active Directory Forest RTS networking shows up. And if I collapse this domains would give you a list of every domain in your entire forest. Now, I only have one domain, and my domain is RTS networking. But if I had child domains or another tree in the forest, that would also be visible here. When I expand my domain, I can see that this default domain policy is already linked to my domain. That is automatically done. Every time you install Active Directory and you create a new domain, the default domain policy is automatically generated, automatically applies to your domain. Now I'm going to click Don't Show this message again in the console. If not, just every time you expand something, it'll just keep popping up. With this default domain policy, that is one of two of our policies that are automatically created. The other is the default domain controllers policy. That is linked to the domain controllers OU. If I expand group policy objects, this folder contains all the group policy objects for your domain. Notice when you look at the default domain controllers policy and the default domain, they have this little shortcut arrow at the bottom left-hand corner. That is a link icon is what it actually is. Basically the same as a shortcut. That simply means this default domain controllers policy is simply linked to this organizational unit. So any policy you create, they all live under this group policy objects folder. An example, I'm going to create a new group policy object, and I'm going to name it Device Install Restrictions. And I'll click OK for that. So you'll see that policy now shows up. If I click on this policy, I can see right now it's not linked to anything because this links here will show you every location this is actually linked to. So now it just exists but does not apply to anyone. If I click on this Settings tab here, and I'm going to click Close in that window there. But right now, if I look in the settings, we can see computer configuration, no settings defined. User configuration also has no settings defined. Now, we knew that would be true because we just created this policy. We have not enabled anything in it. If I click on my default domain policy, still on the settings tab here, if I scroll down in this, notice under computer configuration, there are a lot of settings already defined. So I can see my password settings. Minimum password length is 7 characters. Maximum password age before you are forced to change your password is 42 days based on this policy. Now, I did not define any of this. When we installed Active Directory, it created this group policy object, and those settings are just always defined in that policy. So out of the box, these were the settings we actually had. And if we just keep scrolling, you'll see it has no user configuration settings defined, just those few computer configuration settings. But if I go back to my device install restrictions, now let's say the goal we have is to restrict removable media from being installed. Well, what I'm going to do, I'm going to edit this policy. So I'm going to just right click and edit. I'm going to put this in full screen. Now, I know where the path is for the setting I want. Many times you may end up on Google or some search engine looking for a path because the layout of this can be a little confusing. But if I expand Policies, Administrative Templates, and System, now I'm under the computer configuration. So Policies, Administrative Templates, System, there is this device installation that shows up. If I open that, there is another folder, Device Installation Restrictions. Well, if I open that, there is an option here, Prevent Installation of Removable Devices. Well, if you click on that, it actually gives you a description of exactly what that setting would do. Now, let's say that's what you want. I mean, you look at it, decide that's exactly the setting that I want to apply. Then I can simply double click it. And again, in help, you'll get that same description will show up here. just so you make sure this does exactly what you intend and you don't have any unintended consequences. But if it is what I want, I can simply click Enable, and now this setting is turned on. So if I OK that, I can see in the list it's now enabled. But keep in mind, in this policy, I'm just going to minimize it, it does not apply to anyone right now. All we've done is create this under the Group Policy Objects folder. Well, I'm going to refresh this view, and we'll keep getting this pop-up because of our good internet settings, our internet security. But if I scroll down now, you'll see under Computer Configuration, it has System, Device Installation Restrictions. That's the path to that folder. Prevent installation of removable devices enabled. So an easy way to know what a policy does is to simply click on the policy, go to settings, and it'll show you every single setting, and it'll hide the 3,500 settings that you do not actually have defined. Now let's say you needed this to apply to your computers in the sales department. You can simply go to your organizational unit that you want to link this policy, and you can simply right-click, and there is an option to link an existing GPO. If you choose that, it'll give you a list of every group policy object that exists. You just click Device Installation Restrictions and OK, and now this policy applies to this organizational unit. So if your computer account in the Active Directory domain is in the sales organizational unit, this policy will apply to you, and you will not be able to install removable drives. Pretty fascinating. And this is another one of those things that is like 99% planning, 1% implementation. So to keep the concept simple, you're doing nothing but creating policies, defining the settings you want in the policy, then you are linking the policy to the location that has the user accounts and or computer accounts that you want all those settings to apply. Nothing more than that. Now let's say every user in the domain needed this policy, or every computer needed this policy. You could simply right-click the domain, rtsnetworking.com, and there is the same option, link an existing GPO. If you had selected the GPO at this level, it would now apply to every computer account in the entire domain. Instead, what we did was just linked it to the sales OU, so now it only applies to computer accounts in the sales OU. And the reason I keep saying computer accounts is because when we go back to settings for this policy and scroll to the bottom, it has no user configuration settings defined. We didn't edit any setting under that. We only edited the computer configuration setting. If we had edited some setting under user configuration, then those settings would apply to user accounts in that sales OU as well. Now, something to keep in mind. There are a few other interesting options here. One, when you go to an OU or to the domain, you can simply right-click, and there's an option to create a GPO in this domain and link it here. Well, I'm going to choose that. And I'm going to name this one Security Settings. Now, before I click OK, notice under my Group Policy Objects folder, I only have those 3 policies, the 2 default ones and the device install policy we just created. Well, when I click OK for this, you'll see it added security settings under that Group Policy Objects folder, and at the same time, it actually linked the security settings to the sales OU. So just eliminates the step of creating a policy here, then linking it to wherever it needs to go to. So in one shot, you can just say, create a group policy object and automatically link it here all in one step. But the end result is the same. Pretty user-friendly. Now, I don't want that security settings policy to apply to my sales OU. So let's say you want to get rid of it. You can simply go back to that link and I'll close this window here. I can simply right-click and delete. Now, it does tell you, or ask you rather, do you want to delete this link? This will not delete the GPO itself. When I click OK, that security setting still exists under the Group Policy Objects. It is just no longer linked to the sales OU. So whatever settings, if you had defined any in that policy, they just don't apply to users or computers in the sales OU. Pretty fascinating. The thing to keep in mind about these group policy objects and how they work, we really need to go back to Active Directory for a moment. So I'm going to go back to Server Manager and I'm going to pull up Active Directory Users and Computers. In Active Directory Users and Computers, I have this Sales OU, and that is my Bob Ross user. Well, let's say I also have a new computer account. I'm just going to say RTS Client 01 and OK. So now I have a computer account and a user account. Well, that policy we just defined right here, that device install restrictions, well, when you click on that, if we go back to the scope, it's only linked to the sales organizational unit. So that means your computer user account has to be in that sales OU. So right now, I know if there are 100 computers in the sales OU, 100 computers will get that setting. If your computer is not in the sales OU, you simply do not have that setting apply. So when you create your OU structure, you always have to be thinking about how group policy needs to be applied. And anytime you create a user, a new computer, where they get placed in the Active Directory structure will largely dictate which group policy objects actually apply to their computer account, to the user account. So really, all planning. But to go back to the Group Policy Management console, now let's explore a few things in the policy itself. Now I have my group policy object still open. So this is, if we scroll up, the device installation restrictions. So I'm going to just slide this window over a bit. Sometimes it's a little slow to adjust. That looks better. And I'm going to collapse this here. One of the first things you notice is the way this is organized. So I have computer configuration. Settings here only apply to computer accounts. Then we have user configuration. Those settings only apply to user accounts. They get processed when the user logs on. Computer configuration settings process when the computer gets powered on and starts up. At first, it looks like the settings are completely duplicate. Both computer and user have software settings, Windows settings, administrative templates, but the settings are completely different. For example, if I expand administrative templates in both locations, you do see some overlap. For example, Control Panel is in both locations, but if I expand Control Panel under User Configuration, we have, about a dozen things show up. One of these, prohibit access to Control Panel and PC settings. Well, if I were to simply go here and click Enable for that, you would no longer be able to open Control Panel if this setting actually applies to your user account. When you log in, Control Panel would be missing. If you search for it, it would tell you this is blocked by policy. Nothing you could do to open Control Panel. If we go to Control Panel under the computer configuration, I'm just going to click on Control Panel there. Notice that setting does not show up. We have just 3 folders and just 2 individual settings. So that is true for the majority of these settings. So it's not as if every setting you decide, should this apply to a computer? Should it apply to a user? Largely what dictates that is how the setting can be applied. Some settings are computer-wide, meaning it has no relationship to the individual user that's logging into the computer. It just applies to the entire computer. Other settings are user-specific. Like your wallpaper, for example. If you share a computer with someone else and you have your account, they have theirs, each of you can have your own wallpaper on your computer. That's a user-specific setting. Something like blocking removable media, that is not a user-level setting. That's a computer-level setting. So really, that's what dictates if it's going to be under computer or under user. Now, as we said, there are more than 3,500 settings. Actually, there's 3,572 settings by default, to be exact. We are never concerned about the individual settings themselves because once you find a setting, you just click Enable and it's turned on. Our concern always is more so with how group policy works. When I create a policy, who does it apply to? Who does it not? How do we exempt certain computers and users from it? Just the administration of it. The easy part is just finding the setting and turning it on. Well, I say easy. Navigating through some of these structures at times may not be the easiest things, finding the setting you want, but once you find it, you just click Enable, and that setting is activated. I'm going to close the policy window itself. Now, a few other things back in the structure. Well, we've already seen the domain. You can see the organizational units that we have. We can see the policies associated with those. If I go back and click on my device install restrictions group policy object we created, now the reason we keep getting that pop-up is because this screen is actually running Internet Explorer on the back end. So this is actually populated using HTML. That's why we keep getting that, because servers by default have high internet security settings defined. On the Scope tab, well, we just saw, you click on the policy, you can see where the policy is linked. Now, we'll dig through these other options in a moment. But when I click on Details, one of the things that is unique here, you can enable or disable an entire GPO or part of a GPO. So by default, when you create a GPO, it's automatically enabled. But let's say this GPO is having some ill effect and you want to stop it from working. Well, instead of trying to delete the policy or delete the link, you can simply say all settings in this policy are disabled. Now it just stops processing. You figure out what's wrong, you want it to apply later on, then you could simply come back and set it to enabled. We'll say okay for that. Now it's turned on. The other two options, you can disable one half. So I could say computer configuration settings are disabled, so it would still process the user setting. Or we could say user setting are disabled, and it would still process the computer. So turn the whole thing off or on, or half of it off or on. But that's all we can manage on the details itself. Now if I go to the settings, that we looked at before. Now we'll look at this in more detail when we have more populated settings defined, but this is a quick way just to say, I want to know what this policy actually does. You can look through and see every single setting defined in the policy. That eliminates the need of trying to expand a policy and click through all the windows. My goodness, you would spend hours if you tried to navigate through every setting in a policy to see what's on. Well, I can't even imagine how long that would take. So this is how we do that instead. The delegation is just who can administer this. So we'll see domain admins have really full control. They can edit settings, they can delete. The modify security means they can change permissions related to it. The enterprise admins have full control. If I wanted someone else to be able to manage this policy, maybe you have another group in IT. They're not domain admins, but just another group, and they need control over this one policy. You could simply add that group here, and then you could select edit settings, and they would be able to do that. So just a way to determine who can manage this one specific group policy object. The last tab is this status. Status will just tell you if the policy is working okay. Well, I'm going to click here, and I can see some information about the policy. And you'll see right now it says data is uncollected. That's because this policy was just created. Usually takes about 24 hours before that actually populates. But you can click this Detect Now. What this will do is give you information about how your domain controllers are replicating. So if you have two domain controllers, you could see that you would have those in sync. It would tell you how many domain controllers are in sync, meaning they have completely replicated all the users, computers, group policies to each other, and they're completely synced up. And this would tell me if you have any domain controllers that are replicating at this exact moment right now. Now, we only have one domain controller, so these are always going to both just say 0 and 0. But that's an overview of the basic settings in the group policy object itself.